How do we judge contemporary art outside of the Western context with that of Western contemporary art? In a world with increasingly shifting cultural connections through globalization and post-colonization, it is no wonder that the art world has progressively embraced the contemporary art of international and developing countries. The continuing shift of interest from universal Western art towards a more diverse international art has undoubtedly stirred up the contemporary art scene with new transnational perspectives. But do the rules with which we judge contemporary art change depending on perspective? We more often than not have to evaluate the unfamiliar by comparing it to the familiar. But does this change how we value the art? Or does contemporary art have the power to transcend social, cultural, racial, religious, political, and language barriers? In this presentation, I will be highlighting the poles of East and West, as well as the shift from modern to contemporary thinking with regards to arts and culture, and how these are bridged through contemporary curation that embraces international art forms. In order to begin this topic, it is useful to consider the fundamentals of identity construction, as this plays a big role in the division of East and West. Group identity forms a large part of an individual's identity if they subscribe to a group or number of groups. But this group identity also comes with behavioral expectations that differ from each cultural perspective. An example would be to consider what it is to be American, having Americanness, and how this abstract quality is viewed from an outsider perspective. Being a part of a group will inevitably mean dissociating yourself from other groups, which is often due to insignificant differences between regions or ethnicities. These divisions cause unnecessary conflict over what is essentially socially constructed fictional identities. The French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu explains that regional identity is set to impose a legitimate definition of the divisions of the social world. He highlights the fact that the defining of differences between regions and ethnicities is imposed to control, create, and destroy groups. But Jan Christian Smuts, the South African general and prime minister, argues that when constructing an identity for the other, we involve who we are as much as, if not more than, who they are, stating that consciousness of other selves is necessary for consciousness of self. Put plainly, only by sharing experiences and communicating through language, despite our differences, can we better understand who we are in the wider context of the modern world. To fully understand the scope of Eastern and Western identity and interaction, we must go back in history to the point of colonialism. In Edward Said's Orientalism, a dialectic of superiority and inferiority is studied in its various forms between the West and the East. The authoritative labeling of the Eastern world as Oriental by the Western world is in itself an act of superiority. This power is from gaining knowledge of a culture which effectively dominates it and imposes an identity upon it, based on the Western perspective. Said questions the humanity of dividing human reality into different races, societies, cultures, and so on, stating that these differences lead to polarization, causing the West to become more Western and the Orient to become more Eastern. This defining of difference continued into post-colonial times as regions underwent decolonization. Countries divided and became independent. They reconnected to their tradition and culture here being a social bond that was further strengthened by their leaders focusing on their glorious past. After decolonization, globalization brought about a state of interdependence, with its speed, technology, and commerce. The West is realizing that it cannot live peacefully whilst the rest of the world suffers from poverty and despotism. It can no longer rule over their empire in their best interests. We are all realizing that we must learn how to work together for our mutual benefit. How do we define contemporaneity? Most of the work being produced in this day and age is contemporary, and some aspects of this may include new media and new internationalism. But it is not universal or exclusionary as modern art once was. It is the new modern and the newest phase of modern art in the Western world. Labeling art as contemporary simply identifies that it is being made now. Therefore, we can conclude that contemporaneity is the quality of being in the now, focusing on what is happening in the world right now. The transformation from modern to contemporary art did not happen all at once across the globe. The shift can only be studied through different local perspectives. Terry Smith, the renowned art critic and historian, believes that contemporaneity has unlocked the present group of ideas known to art, to see that they are made up of various simultaneous currents of thinking that have made up art across the world since 1989. This simply highlights the fact that the progression from modern to contemporary is not linear or universal. It can only be studied through these simultaneous currents from different contexts. A large part of contemporary theory is the phenomenon of globalization. It has shaped contemporary art to become a socio-political endeavor, fueled by a need for social change. The newfound Contemporary Art Museum promotes this without boundaries of history or culture. Saloni Mathur, an expert on modern and contemporary South Asian art, believes that the artwork that most defines the complex conditions of our time are those coming from colonial or post-colonial societies. Artwork from non-Western geography no longer needs to fight for a spot in the contemporary art forum, as it has earned its right to be judged among the Western canon. The notion of the new internationalism describes an expansion of the art world to a more global scale, placing non-Western art into the contemporary art world. Opposed to the old internationalism, where they judged non-Western art differently to Western art, and they were ignorant of the scope of contemporary art across the globe. Postmodern terms like multiculturalism or global art are argued as discriminatory by many contemporary art critics, such as Smith, Mathur, and Philipson. They believe it to be a way for Western art to name something differently, because it is different, which is similar to the labeling of Eastern countries as Oriental, and is exactly what the new internationalism challenges. As an example of this international artist, let us look at the contemporary Chinese artist Zhu Diji. The definition of Chinese modernity must be specific to its locality, but is based on the influence of Western modernity in China's history. Diji situates himself as a transcultural contemporary artist, aware of the history and connections between modernity and contemporaneity. He believes in the transformational quality of art, and sees himself as a part of the continuous transformational process of reality. He believes that art has an obligation to connect with reality, this being present and past society. As a tool to understand this concept, Diji has created maps to reorganize and better understand the world, whilst also positioning himself as a person and as an artist within these maps. An example is the map of total art, which visualizes his situatedness in different concepts, histories, and philosophies of art. The center of the map holds the Lake of the Real Freedom, beside the river Fluxus and Marcel Duchamp's ready-made fountain. His combination of various cultural concepts aim to confront and criticize the conventional understanding of the relationship between art and life in order to seek new perspectives and alternate realities. This study of self-situatedness allows critical transcultural research that breaks down the East versus West conflict to focus on areas of interrelatedness rather than areas of difference. The new internationalism opens the world up to the art form, but within developing countries, some artists have found these doors closed to them. The Indian contemporary art scene, for example, is entangled with classist and gender-biased notions of who can contribute to modernism and modernity. This discriminatory outlook began in earlier generations but is still being subscribed to now. Though the left-wing upper-class intellectuals attempt to be progressive, they have been the reason why subaltern artists are marginalized in India. Subaltern in this case meaning lower-class female and tribal artists. To the research scholar S. Santosh, these subalterns are considered integral to the process of modernity, but are not afforded the chance. The upper-class intellectuals may give the impression of openness by positioning one of the exceptional subaltern representatives in the mainstream. All the while, these elites are judging and labeling the subalterns differently as they are considered of a lower level, much like how the non-Western artist is discriminated by the West. The injustice reaches to the point of the elite appropriating the subaltern's material after denying them their contribution to the art scene. Like the new internationalism, the new cultural politics is one that strives for equality. Though it is not against the mainstream, it is not avant-garde either. It simply wishes to redefine the current system of knowledge. The labeling of the other by the Eurocentric system has been undermined by post-colonial thinkers, leading to the death of the high art category, by the emergence of the subaltern in the contemporary art world. An excellent example of this is the Bharat Bhavan Museum in India, directed by the artist and art critic J. Swaminathan. He created an unconventional museum in the early 1980s, which welcomed the display of both Indian tribal art and contemporary art simultaneously. His aim was in repositioning the tribal material from craft to art, as he believed it to be an expression of a vital creative impulse, and not an endangered cultural material. This validity of coexisting cultures is what he defines as contemporaneity. In 1984, Swaminathan served as a consultant for Magicians de la Terre in Paris, recommending Indian artists for this international exhibition. This event launched a new era of globalizing contemporary art and gave equality to artwork from all regions, whether France, India, or Ghana, launching them into the International Art Network. An infamous display from the exhibition was that of a Picasso painting beside an African mask, demonstrating how avant-garde artists reference tribal art, clearly identifying that, though the West has had a considerable influence on the East, there are many examples where even the most traditional Eastern art has inspired the modern Western artist. The new cultural politics of difference gives rise to a new type of critic and artist, and I believe that Swaminathan was one of them. The distinctive traits of this new politics is to seek the diverse, to reject the universal for the specific. This is not a new practice, but what is considered difference at this time in history has changed from previous critique. This new cultural politics is linked to contemporaneity, and as the American philosopher Cornel West puts it, consists of creative responses to the precise circumstances of our present moment. The new cultural politics, as stated earlier, are not oppositional to mainstream or aimed at crossing social boundaries. These new practitioners align with the marginalized to encourage social action towards freedom and democracy. Due to their working within the Institute and also attempting to subvert it, West describes their work as both progressive and co-opted. Subversion of the Institute is different in each context, but he argues that social pressures and political movements have aided this transformation. In a sense, he believes that without a form of conflict, there can be no creative breakthrough. Though this isn't a fact, it is a fact that without any pressure at all, the status quo will remain or regress, leading to stagnation. This statement put into the context of the developing country's socioeconomic and political status may highlight that the conflict or unrest in Asia and Africa, for example, may contribute to their creative production. Which leaves me the question, is it possible for international art to gain a higher level of contemporaneity due to a specific context? Not a question that can be answered without considerable and extensive research. To conclude, though differences in colonization have polarized and divided Western and Eastern cultures, an artistic perspective shows that for many years this divide has been bridged by the work of radical curators and exceptional contemporary artists who have brought their work to the Western audience and the forefront of contemporary practice, claiming their validity in the contemporary art world. The new cultural politics has bred a new kind of critic and artist, one that has flexible sensibilities, who fight for intellectual freedom and international perspectives. This shift towards seeking out the diverse and contemporaneous has opened the platform up for the work of the artists from the global south to take the stage and be judged equally with the elite of the industry. This answers the question posed at the start of this presentation. How do we judge contemporary art outside of the Western context with that of the Western contemporary art? The answer is equally.